How Children Saw Jesus, a cinematic documentary script. One settings per line hook. Picture a dusty street in an ancient town. The sun is setting. A crowd is pushing forward, desperate to touch a man they believe can heal the sick and calm the storm. But in the middle of that crowd, low to the ground, small hands are reaching to children. They are not there for miracles. They are not there for sermons. They simply want to be near him. And what happened between Jesus and the children of his time reveals something historians rarely talk about. A side of this story that is quiet, tender, and easy to miss. This is the story of how children saw Jesus, and how he saw them back. Introduction. To understand this story, we have to leave behind the image of Jesus surrounded only by adults, priests, soldiers, philosophers, and skeptics. Because in the crowded villages of first-century Galilee, children were everywhere. They outnumbered adults in most households. Life expectancy was short. Families were large. And in a world without modern medicine, childhood itself was fragile. In that world, children had almost no social status. They were not allowed to speak in public gatherings. They were rarely mentioned by name in official records. Some historians believe children were treated as property more than as people, valued mainly for future labor. So when the Gospels describe children approaching Jesus and Jesus welcoming them, it was not just a sweet moment, it was something radical. Scene 1. The world children grew up in imagine a small house in Nazareth or Capernaum, mud brick walls, a single room shared by parents, children, and sometimes animals for warmth at night. Children woke before sunrise. Girls helped to grind grain and carry water from the well. Boys followed their fathers to trades, fishing, carpentry, farming, learning by watching, not by asking questions. There were no classrooms, no playgrounds. Education, when it existed, focused on memorizing scripture, not childhood play. Archaeological digs across ancient Galilee have uncovered small clay toys, game pieces, and tiny sandals. Quiet evidence that children still found moments of joy, even in hard lives. But affection for children, as a public virtue, was rare in the ancient world. And that is exactly why what happened next matters so much. Scene 2. Let the children come to me. Now, picture a hillside crowd. Adults pressing close to Jesus, hoping for a blessing, a healing, an answer to their questions. Then, parents begin bringing their children forward too. Some scholars believe these were toddlers. Others believe some were slightly older. But the disciples' reaction is clear in Scripture. They tried to stop it. To them, children were a distraction. Jesus had important work, teaching, healing, confronting religious leaders. Why waste time on the youngest and least significant members of society? But something unexpected happened. Jesus did not just tolerate the children. He stopped everything to defend them. He said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." In a world where children were barely noticed, Jesus placed them at the center of his message. This single moment quietly reshaped how an entire faith would view childhood. Scene 3. A child as the greatest example. Few people notice this important detail. Jesus didn't just welcome children. He used them as the standard for greatness. When his own disciples argued about who was the most important among them, Jesus didn't point to a soldier, a scholar, or a priest. He called a child to stand beside him. Imagine that scene. Grown men, trained in Jewish law, debating status and power, and Jesus placing a small, powerless child in front of them as the model to imitate. He said that unless people become like children, humble, trusting, without pretension, they would not understand the kingdom of heaven at all. In a society built on hierarchy, honor, and status, this was almost shocking. Children had no power to reward loyalty, no wealth to offer, no social influence. And that was exactly the point. Scene 4. The boy who fed thousands now traveled to a grassy hillside near the Sea of Galilee. A massive crowd has followed Jesus for hours, and evening is approaching. There is no food, no nearby market, no easy solution. Then, in the middle of thousands of hungry adults, One boy steps forward. He offers 5 small loaves of barley bread and 2 fish, a simple meal, likely his own family's provisions for the day. It seems like nothing, but what happened next changed the moment into one of the most famous events in the Gospels. Jesus took the boy's small offering and used it to feed the entire crowd. Historians note that barley bread was considered the food of the poor, not the wealthy. This wasn't a rich family's donation. It was a child's ordinary lunch. And yet, in the story, it becomes central to the miracle. This tiny detail reveals something extraordinary. In the story of Jesus, the smallest and most overlooked people often become essential to the biggest moments. Scene 5. Children in the temple. Now picture Jerusalem, near the temple, during one of the most tense weeks in the gospel narrative, the days leading up to Jesus' crucifixion. Religious leaders are furious. Jesus has just overturned tables in the temple courts, confronting corruption in the sacred space. Amid the chaos, children are shouting his praises, calling him the Son of David. To the religious leaders, this was outrageous. Children were not supposed to make theological declarations. That role belonged to trained rabbis and scholars. They demanded Jesus silence them. But Jesus responded by quoting scripture, that praise from the lips of children and infants had been prepared by God himself. In a moment of political and religious tension, the voices of children were treated as legitimate, even sacred. This was not normal for the time, and it wasn't an accident. Emotional peak now. Imagine the weight of it all. A world where children were rarely seen, rarely heard, rarely valued beyond their future usefulness. And one man who kept turning back toward them, not ignoring the crowds, not neglecting his mission, but making space again and again for the smallest, quietest, most overlooked people in his society. A boy's lunch becomes a miracle. A child's presence becomes a lesson in humility. A child's voice becomes an act of worship. In every scene, the pattern is the same. The people the world overlooked were the ones Jesus noticed first. Ending. Today, this story still echoes through history. Modern movements for children's dignity, protection, and education often trace their moral roads back to exactly this kind of teaching. The idea that every child, regardless of status, wealth, or age, carries inherent worth. Historians continue to debate many details of ancient daily life, but one thing remains clear in the biblical account. Jesus consistently defended, included, and elevated children in a world that largely ignored them. Perhaps that is why this story still moves people today. Because in every generation, there are still overlooked voices, still small hands reaching upward, still children waiting to be noticed. And this ancient story reminds us quietly, but powerfully, that no one is too small to matter. End of script. End of script.